We're shifting tack with this session. Up till now we've been talking about fiscal frameworks at both the federal and state level. And now we're moving into more the detail of managing public debt, and in particular building institutions to do that job. Recognizing that this conference is themed around fiscal policy, I'll start off with a couple of minutes defining the territory, talk about the main elements of governance and accountability when you're managing public debt, touch on the international experience, what the differences are, but perhaps more importantly, the similarities of the broad underlying principles that we see across all countries and institutions managing public debt. And then touch on some of the tasks, decisions required in building an institution, again drawing from what we've seen across a range of countries. Starting off with the written definition. This is an extract from the guidelines for public debt management, which were revised earlier this year. They were convened by the World Bank and IMF, but the revision was driven by a working group of 22 countries, of which India was one. And then we had another 20 or so countries providing comments on drafts, so this is a very well wordsmithed document that represented a broad consensus on what sound practices in debt management looks like. So the definition that was derived from this was it's the process of establishing and executing a strategy for managing the government's debt in order to raise the required amount of funding at the lowest possible cost over the medium to long run, consistent with a prudent degree of risk. It should also meet any other public debt management objective goals that the government may have set, such as developing and maintaining an efficient market for government securities. So we packed quite a lot into that. First of all, it's a process, so that speaks to the governance and institutional arrangements required, really the theme of this particular session. The task itself can be really split into two elements. One is the establishment or the design of a strategy for managing public debt, and the objective of that strategy will involve some kind of trade-off between cost and risk. The second broad task is executing that strategy, so doing transactions predominantly in markets. And the definition also draws attention to the special role that the government debt securities market plays in a financial sector, and that debt managers need to be cognizant of that. It is a distinct process from fiscal policy. So fiscal policy, and you can have a lot of definitions of fiscal policy, but is principally concerned with aggregate government expenditure and taxation, but also with the efficiency of tax policy and expenditure decisions. Collectively, that determines the level of debt. The process of debt management concerns itself very much with the structure of the debt, cost and risk of the debt portfolio within acceptable tolerances. So it's about composition. Of course, there are very important relationships between the two. So in developing a debt management strategy, you need to have the projected primary balance and some sort of idea of the risk around that. Also, in the process of developing the strategy, debt managers can provide to the fiscal authorities information about risks in the debt portfolio and any emerging debt sustainability concerns given their window on the market. In one presentation yesterday, debt interest costs were regarded as exogenous, something that the government couldn't control in terms of putting together the budget. I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. At the end of the day, you can't control markets, but governments can have some control over the speed with which that can feed into the government's budget through managing the composition of the debt. So a good place to start when you're thinking about designing institutional arrangements for managing public debt are what are the core elements of the governance and accountability structure. Given that the public debt portfolio is a large percentage of GDP, careful management of it is critical both in terms of financial stability and also fiscal outcomes to the government. And getting it wrong can have dire consequences. We saw that in a number of countries in the 1990s, early 2000s, where composition of public debt did play a role in some debt crises. So therefore, strong oversight and accountability is needed in the process. And in this diagram, if you can read it, attempted to capture the key aspects of that. Starting right up the top. Oops, that was turned it off. There you go. Okay, oh, there it is. Got a pointer. So, can someone get the main view up again, please? Starting right at the top, the authority for borrowing on behalf of the government derives from laws, sometimes even at the level of the Constitution. So that is then passed down in some form of delegation, setting long-term objectives through to the entity that's responsible for managing public debt. That entity, be it a debt management office, within a finance ministry, separate agency, whatever, is responsible for undertaking the analysis and making recommendations on the composition of borrowing to the government. So, and very often consulting with the central bank, consulting with others, possibly an advisory committee, advisory board, is commonly seen in a few countries. So the responsible minister, possibly a cabinet of ministers, makes a decision based on those recommendations in terms of the roadmap for government borrowing, and that decision is passed back to the debt management office, which then will implement that in a series of transactions. Of course, accountability for doing that task is vital, so there is strong oversight. There will be detailed reporting required, oversight possibly by risk committees, internal audit, and of course on its way back up to the legislature, a supreme audit institution invariably in all countries will have oversight of this function. Over the last 25 years or so, there's been a very strong trend for countries to pull all of the areas of government managing debt together into one entity. The starting point in many countries, including my own, I used to head up the New Zealand Debt Management Office. Starting point was we had various bits of government managing different types of debt, so it tended to be by debt type. So one area managing domestic debt, another managing loans, foreign currency debt, and so on. But countries do find benefits in pulling this all together in one place. First of all, it makes the development of that strategy a lot easier. Now, I'm not saying you can't do it if you have a number of parties doing it, but it certainly makes it a lot easier, reduces coordination costs to have it in one entity. It also promotes efficient execution because you have one group of people who are looking across all of your sources of borrowing and can in real time identify the best opportunities for government. And finally, it facilitates reporting. Don't underestimate the task of aggregating from separate units when it comes to reporting on public debt. And nowadays, markets really want to get that more or less in real time. So when it comes to actually doing that consolidation, there is a range of institutional forms that we see across countries. So I think it was about 8 years ago, there was a lot of discussion, is it a good idea to have it in a separate agency or should we keep it in the finance ministry? So I did a paper on it at the time and came up with a categorization of 4 different approaches. First one, a department or a division within a finance ministry or a treasury. So we see this in Brazil, Colombia, Italy, Japan, New Zealand, South Africa, Turkey. So that is probably, it's clearly least arm's length from government. There is direct reporting line to a finance secretary, treasury secretary. The second, a little more arm's length, are agencies set up by executive decision, which we see in Australia, France, and the UK, for example. A little bit further away from central government are agencies set up under specific laws, so statutory bodies, which we see in Austria, Ireland, Portugal, and Sweden. And the last one, fairly rare form, are agencies that are established under general company law, which is the case in Germany and Hungary. But in undertaking that work, I would express a couple of very strong caveats. One is that categorization is simplistic, both within categories and between categories, as it masks a great deal of variety in the detail of institutional arrangements. And you also need to ignore the term agency, office, etc. They're used interchangeably. Sometimes things are lost in translation from native languages. So what are the pros and cons of each? So an agency approach, if you talk to countries that have that, may express that it better supports the specialized requirements that you need in a debt management function and transacting in financial markets. So in terms of IT systems, security, the risk and control environment, financial market skills. Another observation is that if you're setting up an agency, you're effectively forced to develop an agency agreement or terms of reference. So it does create a lot of transparency around accountability, what the task is and what the reporting responsibilities are. But of course, an agency, setting up an agency does create agency risk, and the principal, always the finance ministry, needs to maintain the ability to effectively oversee that entity. On the other hand, those that have maintained the debt management function within a ministry structure would argue that the closer links with the fiscal and budget and planning process assists with the strategy development process. It also helps management of the overall balance sheet, if you're thinking about other liabilities and assets of government. What it also does is it brings within the finance ministry a cadre of finance and financial market specialists that are available to support other activities, such as opining on regulation, capital markets advice, overseeing the activities of government entities that are involved in financial markets. The other thing I observed from looking at institutional forms is they tended to follow an established pattern within that country. So, for example, in Sweden, it's very common to have separate agencies managing large chunks of the government's business. So the Swedish National Debt Office fits that model. In New Zealand, the reforms of the public sector in the 1980s gave individual ministries and departments a great deal of flexibility in terms of how they manage their businesses. So setting up the functions for a debt office in that environment was pretty straightforward. The UK DMO is an executive agency. Again, with their public sector reforms, a great deal of the services delivered by the government is through exactly that type of structure. And lastly, in Australia, the Australian Office of Financial Management is a prescribed agency, of which there are around 52. There's an act that sets out the standardised accountability arrangements for that. So moving now to inside the debt office, how that is organised. You probably, if you've ever looked at the territory, be familiar with the terms front office, middle office, back office. These terms were borrowed from the private sector, from the financial sector. The most important divide is between front office and back office. Front office are those people who undertake the transactions. The back office validates them, confirms them independently with counterparts, and also makes payments. So it's a fundamental operational risk management tool to have those groups separate. Middle office leads strategy development. So the process of designing the borrowing roadmap. There are many other functions that need to be slotted in, and there's a great deal of variety as to how these are done across different countries. So internal risk monitoring and compliance could be in the middle office, could be separately reporting to the head of the DMO, could report to a higher level. I've actually seen a trend in recent years, particularly in OECD countries, to strengthen this and have it outside the debt office. The stakeholder relationships and communication. I've seen it in the front office, middle office, sometimes a shared service with other entities in the ministry. Financial reporting, seen it coming out of the back office, middle office, or even indeed a shared service. Legal services, sometimes a separate group within a debt office reporting to the head, or a shared service within the ministry. Specialised IT, this is not giving you email on the internet, but the IT you need to manage the transactions. That too can be slotted in different places. In the interest of time, I'll leave that there. Towards establishing a DMO, strengthening an entity, here are a few observations that can be made based on what we've seen in a range of countries. So during a reform process, the business of managing public debt, of course, cannot be compromised. It's a core responsibility. So the initial phases of institution building that I've seen in many countries tend to rely on bringing together existing teams. A period of 2 years of design and planning is fairly common. In a lot of contexts, I've seen a very early appointment of the first head of the new entity to support the establishment process, and that particular individual is going to have a high stake in the success of the new organisation. So having him or her on board early is probably a good idea. And not all of the envisaged roles of a public debt management agency or DMO need to be up and running right from the start. A phased approach is fairly common. So turning now to the tasks to undertake when setting up a debt agency. These aren't in order of sequencing. In fact, many of them can be run in parallel, and they also have interactions between them, which are fairly clear. So first stage is defining scope and roles. What do you want this particular entity to do? Of course, there's the core business of financing government, goes without saying. But do you want to include cash management? Do you want to include management of contingent liabilities, retail debt? services for states when you have a federal system. And then there's everything else, and we see a great variety. Sometimes debt offices manage export credit agencies. They can manage lending to other parts of government. They can manage foreign currency risk on behalf of other government entities. So quite a lot of functions which often accrue over time. Second broad area, design of the governance arrangements and institutional setup to achieve the framework that I talked about before. So how will accountability to the executive, parliament, and the public work for this new entity, and then the supporting legal framework to make all of that happen. What will be the reporting and communication requirements? Will you need to contract out some functions? Then you'll need agency agreements to give force to that. If you are shifting functions from existing entities, then how will the interface with those original entities operate in the future? A human resources plan, of course, is critical. Good place to start is analysis of the skill sets of current staff, and then identify areas for supplementation. Countries also take different approaches to terms and conditions and employment for staff, and the relationship with the core public service. Will they be public servants or will they not? Code of conduct for staff working in a debt management entity. Very often that includes more consideration than for general public servants because they're operating in financial markets. An information technology platform is critical. It's the backbone for the operation. So understanding the landscape before you start the process is a good first step. But then there's a range of critical decisions around: are you going to integrate existing systems? Are you going to pick one and extend that as your core platform? Are you going to build something completely new? Are you going to buy something off the shelf and customize? There are no hard and fast rules or particular patterns that we see across countries and how they tackle this. There are some off-the-shelf systems available, but most countries find they have to customize them extensively. Another critical area, design and processes and procedures for operations. For that part of the debt management entity that's involved in executing and processing transactions, it can draw on private sector practices. A lot of debt management offices get audits done by Big Four accounting firms or have engaged them as advisors to help design the transaction processing systems and indeed how operational risk is to be managed. However, the elements of the task that relate to the design of the strategy and policy issues are clearly linked much more to the fiscal and the budget side of the task. Lastly, decisions need to be made around the physical infrastructure and the support services for the DMO. Things as mundane as the location and sourcing of premises, but also the arrangement of support services. Are you going to have your own HR systems in-house? Same with legal and general information technology. And on that, again, there are no hard and fast rules. Each country tackles it in a way that's most efficient for their context. So just a few remarks in closing. The institutional change proposed here in India certainly brings practices in line with what we generally see in most countries, where responsibility for managing public debt is consolidated within one entity, very much under the policy control of the finance minister. So that type of accountability arrangement very much in countries is seen as a package with transparency around monetary policy and independence of central banks, the topic that we've been talking about in this conference, development of fiscal transparency and fiscal rules. The examination of country cases provides very valuable information on how other countries have tackled the issue, and we'll be hearing from one in a minute. Nevertheless, each country, of course, is unique in terms of context, and so deriving some first principles does provide a framework, acts as a touchstone as you go through the process of designing the final form. So we have this in the guidelines for public debt management that I mentioned at the outset. Also, the bank has derived this more as a set of indicators that can test institutional performance. You can use this as a checklist, and it provides more fine-grained criteria for developing an